been talking about social change. And I think the last discussion was really apropos because you're going to see in this presentation a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of social change relates to technology. Most of my work I do, the consulting work I've done before, has been for theme parks, and you'll see that in my handout packet there. I just published a new book called The Immersive Worlds Handbook, and there's an entire chapter on social change, so I'll be discussing that throughout the context of the presentation. To begin with, we can look at Heraclitus, the famous Greek philosopher. And everyone's probably heard this quote, different variations, but one of the quotes that you probably heard of is the idea is that nothing endures but change. So what he was really getting at in his philosophy and his look at society was the idea that change is happening constantly, and change is something we have to prepare for. In some cases, change is something we have to overcome, as you'll see in a second. Sometimes our associations with change are positive, like we talked about with mobile media, with iPads and our phones. In some cases, they're negative, and in some cases, they're maybe in between. So I want to address today some of these ideas in the context of how we all personally adapt to social change, as individuals, as companies, as brands, as product lines, whatever. And I think it's really important to set at the get-go the idea that change is always happening, and it's something we have to address, as Heraclitus talked about. Second thing I wanted to say about this is that really, I don't necessarily claim to be an expert in terms of change, and I would argue that really change is something that you can prepare for, but as far as being an expert in change and saying you can pinpoint when things are going to happen, it's not necessarily the case. There were political scientists that didn't predict the Arab Spring, the social revolution that happened in the Middle East over the last couple years. And so the thing we can really do, I think, is have conversations, develop models, develop methods of understanding to try to focus on change. But maybe we should avoid that sort of expert discourse where there are experts that tell us how to prepare for change. So a conversation is really where we're going to go with this, and the last exercise we'll work on today will be this idea of asking ourselves 10 questions about adapting to change. So first off, we'll talk about some associations of change. We'll then go into a definition, a simple definition of social change. We'll talk about some models that we can use to understand change, a few case studies, many of which focus on mobile media and technology. And then lastly, as I just mentioned, we'll talk about these 10 questions and how to address social change in our own lives. This one here, I'll put up the next slide actually. It's supposed to be moving. It's not moving for some reason, but this is what I have represented here. Basically, I'm trying to talk about, from the get-go, some associations we might have with change. This is not an exclusive list. You could certainly add other things here. Often we think of change in terms of feelings we have. I don't know if any of you have dealt with in the last year, family problems or issues of change in your own family and social relationships. I've been dealing with some recently. And, they can be very difficult, to say the least. And so sometimes when we encounter change, something that's different, it hits us at an emotional level. And that's why I think a lot of times we say there's fear. Maybe at the same time there's some optimism, there's some hope there as well. There's a sense of need. In some cases there's a sense of dread. Studies that have been done about technology over the last few years, they've talked about how some people who maybe are unable or unwilling to adapt to technology have that sense of dread when they try to respond to technological developments in the workplace, and they have to learn new programs or new systems and so forth. So I think it's very important to identify the feelings that we sometimes have relative to change, and then kind of use this as an initial barometer to understand the bigger picture relative to products, to brands, to industry, and so forth. Meanings, and in the quotations here, these are just simply definitions that you see in the dictionary, the etymology of change. So some of these are obvious: a transformation, to give and to receive, to undergo some form of alteration. And what's interesting to me about change is that if you look at our society today, really every fabric of our society, from our political system, right? We have an election coming up very shortly. We're talking about potential change there. You talked about technology today, which is a huge force of change. If you talk about the environment, environmental issues are a key concern because some people argue that things are changing so rapidly that we have to adapt in terms of industry, in terms of the corporate world, and how we go about doing business. So change is one of those things when you look at the meanings of it. It clearly tells us that we have to be prepared, and in many cases be prepared for the unexpected, which falls back on some of those feelings that we often have, that sense of fear and dread about things happening, or on the horizon, looming, and so forth. And then lastly, we could talk about some situations, and again, you could come up with 40 more of these, but I was just thinking about some recently, the change in the economy, developments in media. I mentioned the Arab Spring, the social revolution in the Middle East. Concerns about the family, the changing nature of the family. If some of you are interested in this topic of technology, PBS has done quite a few excellent documentaries recently. One of these is on sort of the digital revolution, and it's the idea of how the documentary starts with the idea, it's called Digital Nation, and it starts with the idea that there's a family that's no longer eating at the dinner table, they're all on their iPads, some are checking emails, and in this documentary there's a father who says, if I want to get hold of my son, it's a lot easier to text message him, right, on his cell phone, than to walk upstairs 100 feet and actually knock on his door and talk to him. So, it's one of those things where you hear that story, it's fascinating, but at the same time kind of sad, because you think, well, maybe that's impacting the values of the family and so forth. So that's a case today I think that's really worthy of some attention. Again, environmental regulation, and how certain products have transformed the nature of culture. And it seems to me, as we get into some models here in just a bit, as we talk about mobile media, as we talk about augmented reality, new technology, this is where we're going to see really rapid social change. And I'll talk about a concept later where you have sort of technology moving like at this pace, and cultures moving at this pace, or the value system of cultures moving at a slower pace. And sociologists call that a situation of cultural lag, which means we have to somehow adapt and catch up with the technology. So it could be the case with a lot of this stuff, including the mobile media I discussed with Digital Nation, that indeed we're going to catch up, we're going to become different, make the changes that are necessary. We just haven't gotten there yet. And so I think that's something else that we could really discuss today and in future conversations, is the nature of media and how it's impacting the family, impacting how we do business, impacting really how we think about the world. And what I wanted to emphasize in that last slide is really the idea that we all have different associations with change. People, depending if they're politically conservative or liberal, might have different perceptions about social change. Same thing with economists. If you talk to economists, some people talk about sort of the long haul and slow adaptation, almost like in the Darwinian sense, right, where things happen slowly and adapt, versus very rapid change, which would be more like adaptive radiation, the evolutionary notions of the late biologist Stephen Jay Gould. So there's differences in how we perceive change, how we understand change, and of course, as we'll talk today, act on change. This is a basic definition by a British sociologist, Anthony Giddens, and he says social change is any alteration in basic structures of a social group or society. And I think it's important to start with the basic definition, because sometimes the definitions are too complex, and you want to really have a broad-based definition so you can try to understand what you're trying to tackle. In this case, we could look at society and say, okay, so just about anything, as we talked about in that a couple slides ago, anything from our feelings to certain situations, politically or economically or environmentally, could fall under this rubric of social change being any alteration in the structure of society. Notice that in his definition, he hasn't identified the cause of the social change, and we'll get to that here in just a second. And so I think really the question becomes, what's next, is kind of that feeling. And again, whether you're a family planning for retirement, planning to send your kids to college, or you're a company thinking about staying competitive in a marketplace in a world that seems to be changing and adjusting ever so more quickly than in the past, sometimes you approach this with a bit of apprehension, and you say, well, how can I plan for what's next, and what are some things that we can do? And let's get into some of that then. So I wanted to present just, sometimes I like models because they allow you just to present things in a simple manner and allow you to plug basically anything in here and to really get a sense of what, in this case, what we're talking about with social change. And by the way, if you wanted these slides or the PowerPoint, my email is in your packets there, so just send me an email. I'll be happy to send that to you. So in this case, we could use the example of a social revolution happening, say, in the Middle East. So you could say, well, there was an initial state, a state where you had leaders that were autocratic, despots who really didn't respect democracy and human rights. This led to political shifts, to activism. Of course, mobile media is a big part of it too, right? If you watch any of the coverage on CNN or Fox or MSNBC or whatever, they were talking about the use of mobile media and how through the revolution of Twitter and Facebook and other social media, people were better able to communicate. I can remember way back when there was the unsuccessful uprising in Tiananmen Square, and at that time they were trying to use fax machines, trying to send information out because the Chinese government was censoring a lot of this. Well, you could say today, that particular moment of technology, that use of social media, is ever more effective. Is it the thing that pushed some of these regimes over the edge and toppled them? That's hard to say, but we certainly know it was a catalyst. And I would then talk about under that state of transformation, you could expand that and say there are different forms of, different types of catalysts that act on a situation in society and cause things to happen. And you could certainly see that. State B now would be the situation where if you look at what's happening in Libya, if you look at what's happening in Egypt and now perhaps in Syria, you could say there's a new state, so it's different than what it was. What's going to happen? And there are certain effects of that. Other countries are talking about intervening in the case of Syria. People are concerned, will these unstable political climates lead to terrorism and so forth? And that's at the level of social policy and governmental policy where things become really interesting because you're doing sort of that what-if scenario again. You say, what's the next thing that's going to happen? What's in our best interest in terms of, if we're coming from a particular geopolitical place and we say, what's in our best interest if this democracy develops in Egypt? What if it goes this way? What if it goes another way? And you start to look at models and you look at best and worst case scenarios. But again, each of those scenarios is dependent on how you view the thing as an actor, how you understand the situation. Let me then talk a little. Here's 4 types of change we could talk about. The first of these is sort of universal. Today's the 11th anniversary of 9/11, right? It very, brings up a lot of, bad memories and hard memories for a lot of people, certainly. An act like that, an act of terrorism, you could say, is a universal form of change because it affects everything and everybody. Affects the media, affects political systems, affected the airline industry still probably today, right, as far as how we have to adapt and so forth. So that's a universal change. An environmental disaster, tsunamis, earthquakes, could also be an example of universal change. Type 2 would be a material change. And the source of change in this case is any kind of invention. So mobile phones, as the last speaker eloquently talked about, would be an example of how that change is in part, again, as a catalyst, fueled by new technology, mobile media. Change type 3 would be immaterial. So this would be someone's idea. Maybe it's an idea for a new brand or a new business model. Maybe it's the idea for a new kind of social group or a new way to look at a political system. That would be coming from the realm of the immaterial, the ideas of the mind, and politics and maybe economics, but it would have an impact on the rest of society. And all these that talk about the consequences. Change type 4 would be something initiated by an individual. You might look at social revolutionaries in the business world, like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, and sort of talk about the idea that these are individuals who had certain conceptions of product lines, of models, of branding. In the case of Apple and Jobs, certainly the idea of connecting brands to people's intimate lives, and many of us who are Mac users for life, there's a reason for this, right? And it's often because of the type of change that was initiated by a visionary like a Jobs, like a Bill Gates, who had a notion and ran with it and were incredibly successful. The last model, I mentioned this before, this is the concept of culture lag. And Charles Ogburn, a sociologist, talked about this. And it's very interesting. He says, okay, the pace of change from slow to fast. So a technological change is moving faster than our ability to change and adapt as a society in terms of our value systems. Can anyone think of an example of where that's maybe happening with technology and our values haven't caught up yet and we're trying to kind of figure that part out? Any examples of that you want to throw out? Anything in your own life that's involved technology and you think like the technology is getting out of control? Well, I'll give you an example from my life. It's talking about cell phone use And my wife and I are always kind of debating this, and she's very particular about, if she's at if we're with our nieces and nephews and we're sitting there trying to have a conversation, and our niece is at the age now where she constantly wants to play these social games with her friends, and I think it's very positive in a lot of ways. It develops creative thinking, and it allows you to negotiate social situations. But the negative side of it is that you want to have a conversation, and you don't necessarily want the child to be playing with that device the whole time. And so as a result of that, we've sort of said, okay, can we ask her to put the device away when we're playing a board game, or when we're out hiking or doing something like that. So again, I think what will happen is in 5 or 10 years, we'll be talking about new technology. We'll be talking about maybe new situations where we have to adapt in that personal sense where you're encountering the technology. And it's great in some ways, but in other ways, it's really kind of negative. And so that's something to always think about on the horizon is technology is changing at this pace, society hasn't quite caught up yet. And that's certainly something we'll be talking about in the next 5 to 10 years. So let me talk a little bit then in the area of case studies. And again, this is coming out actually in September, the Immersive Worlds Handbook. And this is designed for folks who really want to look at theme parks, consumer spaces, casinos, restaurants, and so forth. And it deals with ways to kind of innovate in those spaces and to develop spaces that are exciting for guests. So there's a chapter here, Chapter 8, that's Loyalty, Tradition, and Change. And it really focuses on the long term and trying to get people who are in these industries to think about some practical ways to really conceptualize how do you adapt to the future, how do you develop tradition, and how do you try to keep loyalty among your customers. If you can't see this model in the back, I'll kind of walk you through it. What I was trying to talk about in this model from the book is that you have a space kind of at the top here, and initially, there's some press and media exposure. Competitors maybe take note. It's experienced by people. Over time, you develop this space, and I probably should actually flip it. But over time, then in the middle, you have a space that it starts to get bigger. There's more word of mouth. People accept it into their daily lives. There's even values and traditions and ideas that are developed. And then in the final stage, there's total cultural acceptance. I call that tradition stage. It becomes a cultural institution. And of course, the model for this in the world of theme parks is Disney. And Disney is one of those where people don't even think about necessarily the brand Disney. It's a part of their life. If they're fans of Disneyana and collecting Disney memorabilia, again, it's really part of an important tradition. Now, what I talk about in the book is for this to happen, for that movement to take place, there has to be a key thing, and that key thing is adaptation. And this is a really simple metaphor of looking at this. If you think of the top line, and you say, as a company, as a product line, as a brand, we want to move from point A to B. And maybe you think of that in a literal sense or a figurative sense. That would sort of be the top line. But as we know, because of changes in the economy, I saw in your guide or in your program for other speakers, you talk about regulation. You're always having to adapt. So I think a better way of looking at that is sort of, you could draw a squiggly line, a swirly line, whatever, but it's sort of a line that's constantly moving like this. You're making adaptations, you're adapting and changing as industry is changing, as consumers are changing, as the world is changing. And I think that's an important metaphor to think about. Another thing I talk about, and this is relevant to our last speaker talking about mobile media, I outlined here forms of change, some examples, social impacts, and design impacts. Again, the design impact is looking at the themed space, the consumer space, specific to this particular book. So I talk here about social networking. More people are involved in social networking. So in fact, in a lot of design spaces, you will see today examples, whether it's Foursquare or Twitter, people can check in, people can use the space in a way, adapt to it, and make it their own, and in some cases actually take the space home with them. Talk about technology here, the use of GPS units and so forth. So social change happens in incredibly different ways, and what I was trying to indicate would be both social impacts and design impacts in terms of your actual space. Some context of change. This comes from recently from Condé Nast Traveler, and they did sort of a take on how the world of travel has changed over time, and I found it pretty fascinating. This first one, relevant, of course, to the unfortunate tragedy in the 11th anniversary of 9/11 today. A lot of this relates to terrorism. and unfortunate attempts of terrorists to take down airplanes and so forth. So some of this stuff obviously has happened in such a way that we feel like we can't control it. And for a lot of people, when you go to an airport, sometimes that feeling, that frustration, it kicks in, and that's why they say here in 2010 our dignity is lost. But we might sort of say, well, it kind of has to happen because we want to be safe, we want to protect people, so if we have to sacrifice a little bit in our travel, we probably should. That's that adaptation we talked about with the cultural lag. The situation of currency. So with the birth of the euro, you lost all these currencies. I don't know about you, but I couldn't have named too many of these. My wife and I did travel to Scandinavia this summer, and so you learn about some of these currencies, but of course these are now all gone, and now we have the euro. So that's a form of adaptation and change. Another example here, we have postcards and film. And both of these, of course, relate to mobile media. The fact that people are now using mobile media, the fact that people are not necessarily sending postcards, they're getting on Pinterest or they're getting on Flickr and other sites to share photographs. This has altered the way in which people think about travel and think about the world. And this is, I think, my favorite of the ones, and again, very relevant to our last talk on mobile media. This is pretty amazing. They're saying here, smartphones have taken 24 travel staples and counting. So translation devices, subway maps, cameras, calendars, books, address books. I mean, everything. And before too long, you have the feeling that you're carrying most of your life on your mobile device. Again, maybe that's a good thing, could also be kind of a negative thing. I personally love this. I love when I travel the fact that I can, pull up a subway map if I'm in London or whatever and find my way around. But there's another side of it that says, it's going to alter kind of who we are in terms of our social relationships and so forth. But this one I think is an amazing graphic to look at. What the case studies remind us, going back to our first quote by Heraclitus, is that change will happen, it's constant, and in fact, it's happening often in new and unexpected ways. So the last section of the talk here, and this is meant really more to sort of get us thinking and having a conversation, perhaps stimulating some questions. And in your packet, you don't have to look at it now, but there is this same handout. If you wanted to later, you could jot down some notes. Some of these might not apply, but let me explain it. So what I have here is a question for you to respond to, just again think about. And then on that side, I sort of have the theme of change. So in this case, I'm talking about speed. Now, what I would say is for you could choose that as an individual. So me, myself, how am I going to respond to the fact that change is happening more and more quickly? You could talk about it in terms of your company, your product, your brand, and so forth. So the I here is meant to be very broad, so you can think about that in a very broad sense. So the first one is, since change is happening so quickly, how can I respond to this? And this is the issue of speed, which goes back to that topic of cultural lag and the fact that things are moving quickly and you feel sometimes like you can't keep up with the pace of change. The second one, I would say, deals with identity, or how you think about yourself. Who am I? What is my identity? Or if I'm a company, if I'm Apple, right? What do I think about my brand? What does my brand mean? Change might cause me to alter who I am or what I do best. How can I respond to this? So is there going to be a situation where you feel like you're going to have to adapt in such a way that it changes the core, the identity of who you are as a company? When I was doing a talk a couple years ago for a theme park company, they were talking about this very issue, and it ties in with tradition, which we'll get to in a second. But they were concerned that their brand maybe is a little old or stale, and that they have to adapt and bring it up to date and connect it to younger folks in society to be more competitive in the changing marketplace. And there were kind of two forces. There were sort of conservative people, I think, within the organization that said, we can't do that. This is the core of who we are. It's our tradition. It's our identity. And they were kind of the avant-garde, the new blood, saying, well, no, we need to change. We need to adapt, because if we don't, we're going to die, right? And it's sort of that thing in the idea of the survival of the fittest, which the sociologist Herbert Spencer talked about. And of course, Darwin talked about in evolutionary theory. If you don't adapt, you cease to exist. And that's the case with biological species, and that's the case with brands and companies. So it's important, but at the same time, I think you have to think about, can I balance the amount of change and also keep the core of who I am as a business, as a product, as a brand? The third one is social, and this really ties in with the mobile media stuff, the technology. Social change creates strange and unexpected bedfellows, right? We certainly saw this happening in, with the Arab Spring, the social revolution in the Middle East, where new relationships are created, new social groups. We're saying, and this is happening in Iraq right now, in a very difficult political situation, we want these groups of people who have hated one another for thousands of years to be together, to hold hands and sing Kumbaya kind of thing, right? This is a challenge in our world today, to say we want folks to come together to experience harmony and so forth. So this is a tricky part of adaptation. Competition, this is one that happens in the world of branding. If a change happens, how do you adapt? In some cases there's the idea of copying. You try to copy something, but then that challenges your authenticity as a brand if you end up copying one of your competitors. The fifth area is kind of related to the idea that I want to have a say as a company or as a brand. If I'm being asked to change, and this sometimes happens with regulations, right, where new regulations come in, maybe environmental regulations, and in some cases the regulations are the result of politics and not any objective scientific criteria that are actually saying, you need to change this particular aspect of your product development or product use because of environmental harms. It could be happening for political reasons. We know our regulatory systems are often driven by politics. So as a result, you say, well, I don't want to lose my voice in this. I don't want to lose control over my product, my brand. 6 is integrity. If I'm being asked to change before, all the parts of my company can catch up and manage and so forth, how can we respond to this situation? We're dealing with this right now at the community college where I teach at in the South Shore, where more and more students want online education, and we're saying, okay, great, let's offer online classes. But then some people, again, the conservatives in the organization would say, well, is that going to challenge the integrity of how we teach? Is it really meaningful for students in the same way that it's meaningful to take a class in person? And we have those kind of debates and discussions.